It's a particular pleasure to make this introduction. I'm usually a fan of really short introductions, but I'm going to make somewhat of an exception here. It'll be a little longer than normal. Coke Stevenson Reed took his PhD here at UT in 1966. He was a student of H.S. Wall. I hadn't met him before he graduated, but the following fall, he came to Georgia Tech with a position. And I was at Emory. And so I claim him, and I think he claims that he was my postdoc at Emory. We had a seminar in dynamical systems, when dynamical systems was just not quite the rage that it became. Well, so we had this seminar. We had the book Neminsky and Stepanov, and I was running the seminar, and so it was IBL, but somebody had to read the book to get the theorems and definitions, and so that was me, but we all worked on them. Well, he did a huge part of the work, but I'll have one anecdote from that episode. As part of our seminar, Coke came across a piece of literature that had a very interesting result in it. It was interesting to him. And it had a curious statement. It said that there's no proof in the literature, but an argument is well known to the Russian savants. Coke found a counterexample. So much for savants. Of course, you say a savant to Coke, and that's just like a red flag to a bull. But I mean, that you can't make a counterexample, even if you don't like just because you don't like the word of savant. Fast forward ahead a couple of years. I was at the Institute for Defense Analysis. Now, that's a private institute, but its only client is the National Science Foundation, which please forgive me, National Security Agency. And it's the largest employer of mathematicians in the entire world. Well, I wanted to recommend Coke. I started out by showing them a clipping of where he won this 24-hour bicycle race, just to show his determination. And I promised him that they would either have some outstanding results or a pile of ashes at the end of the summer. Well, we had results. Well, that was the start of a long association between Coke and the Institute for Defense Analysis. Now, he ended up being one of 6 civilians receiving a medal from the National Security Agency, one of 6 out of thousands of mathematicians. And I assure you that the country is more secure because of his work, both his recruiting and especially his mathematical work. Now, that work is not, the nature of it doesn't fit in your vita. You don't put it there. Not the vita that anybody sees. So after this association with IDA, mainly during summers and maybe one year, he took a position here in Austin at the Microcomputing Consortium. And he was the first non-administrative employee chosen from it. Bobby Enigma was instrumental in getting him there. His reputation was such that already. Well, after that, soon after that, to go to MCC, he left Auburn. And then from MCC, he went to IDA full-time and became very interested in computer hardware. And he's the founder and head of Data Vortex, which is now headquartered here in Austin. When the University of Texas was courting him to get him to come here, we had a session with hot and cold running vice presidents and deans, trying to convince him to get there. So we sat around the table, and Coke was telling him old stories about his days at UT. He started out saying that he went here because it was the only university within walking distance of his house. Now, he was gone for 1 year. He actually played football for Texas A&M, but we kind of usually don't mention that. I guess I just did. Well, anyway, without any more ado, I'll make one more comment. He has an extraordinary beta it's not a standard academic one. At Auburn, I want to mention that he and Christina Cooperberg solved a famous problem of Stan Ulam's, for which they received each a bottle of wine. But it's a famous problem. It was in dynamical systems. But at any rate, he has an extraordinary view of teaching in IBL from a number of points of view, from the undergraduate through the graduate, through the research. All this IBL is aiming towards research and mathematical accomplishment. But he also has an extraordinary, particularly rare view of how the pure mathematics and the research on highly important technical problems are really one and the same. So he has particular insights to IBL. Now he's going to tell you quite a bit about his very innovative computer, the details of which are haven't been spread around, but will be soon. But it's a world-changing thing. Well, so fasten your seatbelts and welcome Coke. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I would sure like to meet that fellow that John was talking about. A lot of the people that I've met, I consider my heroes. I certainly consider Professors Moore and Wall as heroes, and I certainly would put my colleagues in that category. And all of these heroes, a good many of which are in this room tonight, are independent thinkers. They're not interested in walking on well-trodden paths. And that's, of course, what research is, to go where no one has been before. I also want to point out that the computer is a mathematical object. It's not a piece of hardware like a television set or a cell phone. It's a mathematical object like a Cantor set. And I believe that to make real progress in the area, it's necessary to build a theory around the type of computer that you want to build. And that theory is a mathematical theory concerned with a mathematical object. So I'm going to go back and give a little history. And of course, a good starting place with this crowd would be Socrates. When I was younger, I read Plato's Trial and Death of Socrates. And for this talk, I read it again. And it certainly does, it certainly is a different book when you've got a few more miles on your odometer. So I'm going to, the first stage of history I'm going to talk about runs from 1,000 years from Socrates, well, actually from Pythagoras through the Library of Alexandria. And that's 1,000 years. And a lot happened during that time that we'll just touch on. I will say that Socrates' trial and death gave him an opportunity to teach his students one more thing, and that was the value of self, the value of your philosophy, and the cheapness of compromise. He could have escaped death, you know, and he chose not to. So Plato wanted this type of thinking to go on, and he established the Plato Academies, and they eventually morphed into what is the Library of Alexandria. And through that 1,000 years, you find Euclid and Aristophanes and Diophantus, and finally Hypatia. Hypatia was murdered when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and she was skinned to death with clamshells for basically the same reason that Socrates was killed. She was killed for impiety to the chosen gods of the rulers and for corrupting the youth. After the library fell, the earth fell into 1,200 years of darkness. Galileo sort of put a crack in the door for light, and Newton blew the door off the hinges. Now, inquiry-based learning was not very popular at Cambridge. It was read, lecture, test, read, lecture, test. It was about as bad of an example, particularly sad because the minds you were running were quality, okay? But fortunately for civilization, Europe had a plague, and the students at Cambridge were sent home so that they wouldn't give it to each other. And Newton went to a farm in his family, and while he was there, he discovered, of course, calculus and celestial mechanics and the rest of standard Newtonian physics. He's another example of the heroes who are independent thinkers. He worked alone. If he'd have been forced to continue at Cambridge, we don't know what would have happened. But he went away and worked alone for a time. And of all the people that I see, I run over that so many times in here. I saw, Sam Young's Christmas at Big Lake paper. Get out in the country and think. Einstein was at Princeton, and he said, American University in general and Princeton University in particular have the students so busy learning they don't have a chance to think. I went to Cambridge, where there was a joint meeting of the American Mathematical Society and the London Mathematical Society, and of course I wanted to see Principia, and it's in the Wren Library. And the way a book gets in that library is to be written by a professor or a student of Trinity College, which that library is huge because Trinity College is almost a fourth the size of Austin High. While I was there, I found out that the real meeting for this joint meeting of the London American Mathematical Society was for Andrew Wiles to make an announcement. And he lectured for about 4 days, and at the end, people thought, oh my goodness, I think we're going to have something here. Andrew Wiles is another example of somebody who was out of the mold. He thought alone. Never saw him in the math department during those years. He was out, he liked to work in his office, and he liked to walk down on the towpath. When Newton came along and discovered this is the world and these are the rules that govern it, all you have to do is solve these equations and you can find out the rules. Uh-oh, the equations have infinitely many terms to add up, or else there's a transform. So solving the problems required a new type of arithmetic that hadn't been done before, so people started making these primitive calculators. Leibniz made one, and a guy named Babbage made one. He got an American equivalent of $2.5 million, but he sort of never finished his computer. It seems like a good way to kill a project is to get the National Science Foundation to heavily fund it. Now, if you've got a hard problem to solve that's going to require a lot of calculation, a computer is certainly a good thing, but an algorithm is at least as important. And so Carl Friedrich Gauss discovered the fast Fourier transform, which is straightforward way would require n squared operations, but to do it, to rearrange the work brings it down to n log n, and that's just a rearrangement of the work. And he drew this picture about how to rearrange the work, and he and his friends sat around tables and did their calculations, and they knew who to pass those answers to. In those days, the time to pass the answers was trivial compared to the time to make the calculation. That's the opposite of parallel computing today. So in 1965, Cooley and Tukey wrote their famous paper on this. I think that's the longest that I could find of somebody publishing something that had been published, that long ago. So this is the first parallel algorithm. And he not only gave the algorithm, but he gave a wiring diagram for how the messages should be passed. And you see some of those down at the bottom of the picture. He's got some horizontal and some vertical boards like computer boards. And this connection connects horizontal and vertical boards through these pins. You can pass this around later. This connection was patented by our chief engineer because the USPTO did not go back to Gauss for prior art. And we're going to talk about Goertingen in a minute. Yeah, we're going to talk about Goertingen in a minute. And Gauss, they wanted to put him in their collection of stars. And he said, if you will build this telescope for me, I will come. Now, when we think about Goertingen, we think about Hilbert and the mathematicians that work for him. But there was a bridge from Gauss to Hilbert. And these are the three people that were walking on the bridge. First course I took in mathematics at the University of Texas was 321K. And of course, the first thing we found out after a few days of learning how to use the English language was the Dedekind cut axiom. And I assumed that maybe Dedekind was using the correct language. I went back and read it in the original, and he didn't know, he wouldn't use the kind of professional language that a mathematician would use today. But Cantor and Lebesgue did. And so this is an interesting little bridge, because if you were a student of Professor Wall, you walked this bridge, starting with the completeness axiom and then proving carefully selected problems from Cantor and Lebesgue. And you spent a lot of time proving theorems from Hilbert and Banach and so forth. I got out my old 321K notes. The first page says, my professor in there was a graduate student at the time, Bob Jolly. And I wrote, Mr. Jolly says, there's no such thing as two adjacent numbers. I didn't say there's no such thing. I just said, that's what he says. Okay. There's a problem today in that the kind of careful use of the English language that we've become accustomed to in mathematics doesn't live in the world of computer science. To a large extent, they've got a problem, and they don't know how to even say what it is. So, of course, I'm prejudiced because I'm a mathematician. So, in a history talk of where we are today, you have to make a stop at Goertingen. Goertingen was pretty good in physics and chemistry. They got 44 Nobel Prizes. Eat your heart out, Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. I've got pictured in the mathematics here, Hilbert, Klein, and Hellinger. Also, there was Riemann and Dirichlet and H.S. Wall. In physics, of course, there's Einstein and Max Born and Oppenheimer, who later directed the Los Alamos laboratories, and Heisenberg and Minkowski. John von Neumann was Hilbert's assistant. Now, Hellinger was Wall's good friend, and of course, as a graduate student, we studied a lot of Hellinger theory, particularly the Hellinger integral. In 1933, the Nazis rounded up the Jews and kicked them out of Göttingen. Hellinger was Jewish, but he wasn't kicked out because he was a World War I veteran of the German army. But later on, they came and rounded him up, took him off to Dachau. Now, Professor Wall, one of our mathematical heroes, got all of he was on leave from Northwestern, and he got his friends at Northwestern and other places to donate enough to bribe the Germans. And as far as I know, he's the only person that ever walked out the front door of Dachau. He went to Northwestern for a while, but then Wall came to Texas. Okay, now people will say in this room, everybody say, well, write your favorite 25-word definition of what the Texas method is. And so I will do mine. Students observe the work of others, but they do their own work independently. The subject matter is challenging to a level that to solve a problem takes greater and greater amount of time, preparing the students for the day when the problems take years. And finally, rigor is demanded, builds confidence, and there's a general feeling with the professors that it's not necessary to teach the subject matter that the students will use in their research, which is wise because that research won't have anything in common with the subject they might teach. That's another confidence builder. Now I'm going to go on. We saw the Nazis sweep through Göttingen, so we can't be far from the Second World War. And this gentleman on the right is Marian Wojcicki, who was a graduate student in Poland of mathematics. But Poland was, of course, nervous, living right next door to the Nazis, and Wojcicki dropped out of graduate school to help decode the German Enigma machine. He was successful, and one of the first messages he read was, "We're going to Poland, and we're going now." I'll go back to what he did immediately following that, but one thing he did was he informed France and England how the machine worked and how he would decode it. But the Germans, the Allies, were not careful as to what they did with that early transmission, and the Germans became suspicious they were being read, so they came up with a more complicated machine. And so they thought, this is not going to be done by hand like the graduate students did. We're going to have to build a machine. And when they decided we're going to build a computer, they, of course, turned to Alan Turing. Now, Alan Turing was an interesting guy. He was an undergraduate at King's College, Cambridge, but he went to Princeton to study under Church. Now, we'll go back. We heard about our friend Hilbert at Göttingen. Hilbert believed and tried to prove for a long time that there was a finite set of axioms that all mathematics would follow from. And we know now that that's not the case. The first reason for that given by Gödel, but later Church had a different method of showing the incompleteness result. And finally, Alan Turing had a very interesting way of doing it. He defined the universal machine and the fact that there was a problem that machine couldn't solve implied that there was not a finite set of axioms for mathematics. This gives us insight into the fact that the computer is not something for applied mathematics only. It proves the incompleteness axiom. It disproves. So Turing made this machine. It's the first example of a parallel computer. It makes a certain amount of noise because it's electromechanical. And it read the Germans, all the German land communication. And so what do you do when you're reading thousands of pages of communication a day? You hire somebody who, first of all, is a speed reader, and second of all, can take all this information and integrate it and say, this is what they're doing, don't you see? And the person that they had was Andrew Goodpaster. Goodpaster had a degree, his undergraduate from West Point. He's a 4-star. He has 2 Purple Hearts, one in Africa, one in Italy. And in order to escape his 3rd Purple Heart, he was sent to work with George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. And they had breakfast. He had breakfast with Eisenhower every morning. He said, this is what I read last night, Ike. Here's what they're up to. Go get them. During that time, you see stories about how smart General Patton was and the way he could always outsmart Rommel. Okay? Believe it if you wish. Now, the Germans came online with another machine that was more complicated, but it was higher data rate, and for that reason was susceptible to statistical attacks. This was the machine just used by Hitler and his closest associates. We never saw that machine, but it was nevertheless diagnosed, an attack diagnosed from traffic only. The mathematician on the right was Bill Tutt. He's a person in graph theory. After the war, he went to Canada. And on the left is Tommy Flowers. So a good way to build a machine is for a mathematician to team with a crack engineer. We've tried to do that in our little company. And that machine in the middle is the decoding machine. And just in those few years, a lot of stuff has happened. Turing's machine was electromechanical, and this machine is all electronic. And if you see in front all those paper tapes running around in there, okay, I found out from this, preparing for this talk, that in the United States we've got a guy named Rube Goldberg, and they have someone in Europe called Heath Robinson. And the official name for this machine was the Colossus, but the colloquial name for it was Heath Robinson device. Now I'm going to go back to Poland. Okay, when they got the first reading of Enigma, in addition to telling the French in English about its operation, they told the local mathematicians, in particular the Jewish mathematicians, that they better get out, particularly if they had something they could do for the Allies. Now, this was at Lvov University. Banach was the director of the institute. And Ulam was one of the young mathematicians there. He got off to a good start. He published his first paper in Fundamenta when he was 18. It's a little something. So at this building on the right, in the lower floor, was the Scottish Cafe. And the mathematicians drank there had coffee and meetings there, and probably more mathematics was done there than in the mathematics building. They kept a list of all the unsolved problems at the time, wrote them down in the Scottish book, and before they took out, they buried the Scottish book under the goals of the football field. That's what they call it, football. Stan Ulam's father took Stan and his younger brother to a ship and sent them off to New York. And probably before that ship docked in New York City, the Nazis had caught the rest of the Ulam family and murdered them. Stan Ulam was quite a traveler. He visited John von Neumann, who was a Hungarian. Von Neumann thought things in Europe were going to deteriorate, and he got out. So he got out because von Neumann was Hellinger's assistant, and he saw what was happening over at Göttingen. So Stan Ulam arrived in the United States and said, "Johnny, I'm here. Is there anything I can do to help?" And von Neumann said, "Get your citizenship, and then I will meet you in a little town. It's called Santa Fe, New Mexico." Okay, so here's a picture of Ulam and von Neumann. Von Neumann on the right, Ulam on the left. Von Neumann always had a suit on. There's a picture of von Neumann riding a burro down the Grand Canyon, and he's got this three-piece suit on at the time. And the kid in the middle with the T-shirt on is Feynman. In the room where they were designing weapons, there were rows of people running calculators, and Ulam said to von Neumann, "Johnny, could you build me a machine that could do what all these people are doing?" And Johnny said, "I think I can." Just like calculus is not well taught, of course, physics is not well taught either. Physics is not well taught. Just like calculus, there's a problem with undergraduate physics. And so the Feynman wrote these beautiful notes on physics, and they're arranged in a tree. So if I was to go there and say, "I'd like to come this summer, what can I do?" He said, "We're going to work on this." That will be like section 3 of book 3, chapter 4, section 3. And then there's a tree that tells you how to go back to what you know. And so that's a beautiful tool that he developed. It's a beautiful book, set of books. Meanwhile, at the end of the war, von Neumann went to Princeton, New Jersey, to the Institute for Advanced Studies. And he took his computer manufacturing knowledge there and built the UNIVAC machine at the Institute for Advanced Studies, which is also pictured there. John von Neumann had this to say about calculus. The calculus was the first achievement in modern mathematics, and it's difficult to overestimate its importance. I think it defines more unequivocally than anything else the inception of modern mathematics and the system of mathematical analysis, which is its logical development, still constitutes the greatest technical advance in advanced thinking. So calculus is sacred. It's not something that we give the students a big orange book, and they run through to where they can put in the correct answer to problems under the guise of having learned calculus. It's a sham. Anyway, that's what Ulam had to say about Newton. John alluded to our relationship with IDA, which is the Institute for Defense Analysis in Princeton. Its first director was Dr. Richard Labler. Richard Labler was a student of H.S. Wall at Northwestern University. And he decided to set up an institute to practice the Texas method in the setting of communication. He invented a Kobeck-Labler statistic. It measures the distance between two distributions, and it plays a big role in the theory of communication theory. Now, IDA and Institute for Advanced Studies and Bell Labs are all within walking distance. And, oh yes, Carolyn says point out that there's a lot of IDA mathematicians in the room. John got me on, and I got on other people, and you walk in there the first time, and you figure, I'm going to get an assignment. What's this place like? And you walk in, and you sit down, and they say, well, here's a problem I'd like to work on. First part of the problem is I don't really know what the problem is, okay? If anybody gets a good idea, come back. I thought, oh my gosh, I've gone to heaven. So Labler, the distribution that Labler the statistic that Labler developed jointly with Kolbeck is, of course, called the Kolbeck-Labler statistic. And there's lots of beautiful statistics out there, and just looking at the statistics gives you a big insight into the problem. Like the Fermi-Dirac statistic gives you a big insight into what quantum mechanics is. There's Claude Shannon at Bell Labs. I never had the privilege to know him, but Claude Shannon axiomatized information, and just like Moore had point and region, Labler had bit and sequence of bits. Now, there's going to be a good bit of this talk that's going to turn to our good friend Seymour Cray. Seymour Cray, at the age of 10, his father gave him an erector set, and his first project was to have it read a paper tape and translate it into Morse code. When he finished high school, he went straight into the Army because the Second World War was going on, and he moved into intelligence and began working on the Japanese problem. And for a time after he graduated, he worked at the National Security Agency, where he cut his teeth on building machines, on building special purpose devices. In 1963, he was working for CDC, and he came out with the CDC 6600. If you've ever been to Yorktown Heights and you see the T.J. Watson Research Center, it's a pretty impressive building, okay? Oh, yeah, yes. That's the research division of T.J. Watson, of course, was the chairman of IBM, and the T.J. Watson Research Center is IBM's think tank. So here's a letter from T.J. Watson to the company. Last week, Control Data announced the 6600 system. I understand the laboratory, there are only 34 people, including the janitor. Of these, 14 are engineers and 4 are programmers. Contracting this modest effort with our vast development activities, I fail to understand why we have lost our industry-leading position by letting someone else offer the world's most powerful computer. His competition understood that the computer was a mathematical object and did the research that was necessary to build a correct one. Now, if you look, there are 34 people. I don't know how good you can see it in that picture, but those boxes are full of wires. And so most of those people had a soldering iron in their hand. When I got to IDA, the 6600 is what we had for a tool. I came back a few years later when Seymour developed the Cray 1 and delivered it. Now, if you read some of Seymour Cray's quotes, you think, oh, this was a student of the University of Texas. Here's some quotes. Well, you have to understand a blank piece of paper isn't a blank mind. Every time you take a new approach, new ingredients, you increase risk. But it was my feeling that reward would come. And I like this one. I tend to work alone. That lends itself to computer design because it is hard to do that as a group effort, group activity. Okay? A lot of people feel that pure mathematics is one thing that can be done by an individual, but designing a computer is not something like that. One of my guiding principles, he said, is don't do anything anybody else is doing. Seymour Cray's next machine, that Cray Research's next machine came out in 1996. Seymour was not actually the chief architect because he was working on another machine. But that machine was the Cray T3E, and it was a gorgeous parallel machine. But it was not efficient. On the fast Fourier transform, its floating point units were busy only 5% of the time. because the rest of the time they were waiting for data. Now, Moore's law says that depending which flavor you accept, every 15 or 18 months, the processor doubles its demand for data. But it turns out, in a study that we did inside, the network's ability to deliver data doubles only every 30 months. So there's an exponential divergence between the appetite of the processor and the amount of data that's given it. And that's why the Cray Jaguar, which has now been renamed Titan since it got new, faster chips, which is in Oak Ridge Laboratories, is no longer 5% efficient. It's 0.027% efficient. That's why it's sucking up all the power from all the dams on the Tennessee River. I visited them the other day and was telling them about our forthcoming machine, and they said, we don't care how much the price is. We get our money from the government. They've got a printing machine, but they can't print watts. Okay? So they're hard problems. They're the problems, of course, that require communication between the processors, Fourier analysis, partial differential equations, particularly stiff partial differential equations. That require sparse linear algebra. All of those are the kind of problems that machines today are having a hard time with. And so that's why this group of Texans is attacking that. Now, I'm going to go back to the Scottish book. In the Scottish book that was buried, Ulam had one of his friends dig it up and send it back to the labs. And I was there at the time. And there was a problem that was stated, like the slide says it, but I would say another way to state it is there a dynamical system that has a uniform bound on all the orbits and no fixed points. And I was able to participate in the solution of that problem because I was working with an incredibly bright Polish mathematician named Krystyna Kuperberg. Now let's look at the unsettled questions and the problems that are the great unsettled questions. It's not the question themselves, but it's what their solution spawns. So on the left in that picture is a solution to the Seifert conjecture due to Krystyna Kuperberg, where not only is there no fixed point, there are no periodic orbits either. And on the right is the thing I got out of that example, which is a dynamical system that carries information rather than data. And it's the foundation of my research today. The example on the left is described in Fundamenta Mathematica. And the one on the right is described in the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Okay, so here's a picture of some friends that are associated with our effort. Jane Brown, J.P. Holmes, who unfortunately passed away. He was a wonderful mathematician and a wonderful friend. John Hendrickson, Gordon Johnson. Gordon's a student of John's. David Murphy. He was a fellow graduate student of me. John Neuberger, who some of you may have heard of. There's Mike Profit, and Jack Rogers, and Bill Transu, and Sam Young. Unfortunately, Transu's no longer with us either. So we don't stop here. We can't. This is no time to rest on our laurels. What's the next generation going to do? Well, that girl on the right is Lee Behavior, Bill Behavior's daughter. One thing that I like about IBL extends the Texas method from just producing PhD level mathematicians to taking it all the way down to kindergarten. And that's important, I think. And I think that it's really fun to watch the elementary school teachers at these meetings and look at how excited their students get at an early age. And that guy on the right is John Neuberger's son, John Michael, and John Michael is beginning a project on one of our machines on sparse linear algebra. Okay, Between my graduation my senior year and my first year as a graduate student, this statue was erected on the West Mall. And it has to do with passing the torch from the professor to the student. There's a lot of things I like about this statue. First of all, it's not a book that's getting passed. It's a torch that's on fire. And it's not passed from this committee to that committee. It's passed from this individual to that individual. So when I was reading through all of my notes and trying to decide, when I was reading through a lot of this history, I read all this history here, and I finished and I thought, where would I like to have studied? Alexandria, Athens, Göttingen, Cambridge, Princeton, Lvov, Warsaw, or Austin? I'm not going to tell you which one I choose, but I bet you know. Okay, so thank you. Thank you.